Let us take you back to July 16, 1945. On this day, a team of nuclear engineers detonated the world's first nuclear device ever, right here in New Mexico. It's hard to overstate this moment. This moment ended an era and started a new one. 21 days later, a U.S. bomber flew over a city in southern Japan with one of these bombs in its belly, and it dropped it from 30,000 feet above the ground. The bomb dropped for 43 seconds before exploding a few hundred meters above the ground, turning this city into dust. This was the first time that a nuclear weapon had ever been used to kill humans, and 3 days later, the U.S. dropped another one on another city in Japan. 360,000 people, most of them civilians, dead from these attacks. The president at the time, Harry Truman, was on a ship crossing the Atlantic from Europe, his voice broadcasting across the world. An American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The nuclear era had begun, and soon it became a race. The only way to keep developing it was to test it so that they could understand how to build these things. The first test was here in the US, but soon the tests moved far away from the US, deep into the Pacific. This is the story of a bomb, and it's also the story of the cultural shockwaves that these faraway tests created here in the US and around the world. From French swimsuits to propaganda films meant to deceive the nation to monsters and Japanese protest films, this story has some twists and turns. So buckle up and let us tell you the story of why the US bombed the shit out of these islands. Okay, let's back up and talk about that very first nuclear test in New Mexico. This is the bomb that they used. They blew this thing up in the most remote place they could find in the US, 100 miles south of Albuquerque, in the middle of the New Mexican desert. Because this was the first nuke ever, no one really knew what was going to happen. They had no idea how explosive this thing was, and so this guy who ran the test range, his name was Norris Bradbury. He was in charge of measuring this, of assessing how big the blast was so he could report and be like, "These nuclear bombs are this powerful." He was not ready for what he saw next. After the explosion, he said, the atom bomb did not fit into any preconceptions possessed by anybody, i.e., you can't fathom how insanely powerful this thing is. You could see the flash and feel the shockwave from 160 miles away. It was clear that this bomb was unpredictable and hard to measure, and scientists were realizing that the radiation from this bomb could spread, and they didn't know how much and how far and how dangerous this thing would be. The director of the project of the nuclear weapons sort of freaked out with the lack of precision on all of this. He's like, did we just poison the entire southwestern United States with radiation? So they realized that they had to find a more remote place if they were going to keep testing their nukes. And so this is where the treasure hunt for the perfect nuclear testing site begins. So you get these two naval officers who were tasked with finding the next nuclear test site, and they literally just said, "We just took out a dozen maps and started looking for remote sites." As they were looking at these maps, they quickly realized that nowhere in the US is a good fit for a nuclear test site. They needed somewhere that was extremely far away from population centers, and they needed it to not be freezing cold, like in Alaska or something. So here comes Harry Truman, the president at the time. In the course of 30 days, this guy just tested this new bonkers technology, which happened to put an entire city at risk. He literally destroyed 2 Japanese cities and won the war with this technology. From a global control and leadership perspective, this guy is feeling very powerful, except for he's a little bit nervous about the intel that the USSR is working on the same weapon. And now Truman is being told that you can't test these weapons on American soil because they're too close to population centers. So what do? So Truman decides that if the perfect nuclear test site doesn't exist, he will make it exist. So back to these maps. Where do we go? Where do we set up the test site? They start looking far, far away off of US soil, deep into the ocean, and they eventually settled on this little strip of beach called the Bikini Atoll. The name Bikini means coconut island roughly in the local language. The problem was that there was a bunch of people living on these islands. Oh, and by the way, this isn't 1893. You can just show up and steal islands anymore without people getting sort of pissed off. So Harry Truman, what do? You send in this guy, Mr. Ben Wyatt, and he is on a mission to obtain this atoll from the locals so that the US can turn it into their nuclear playground. One Sunday after church, he gathers all the local Bikinians to ask them if they would like to leave their island, and he promises them, "This will be temporary, we just need it for a little bit." And the people are like, "Okay." But don't worry, Ben is prepared for this. He's just buttering them up with Jesus, and it is so blatant. So eventually we're not really sure how it all went down with whatever backroom deals, but under the condition that these people would be able to come back, they agreed to leave the island, to hand them over to the US. They ship away these natives to nearby islands with no food, water, or shelter, and then the bombs begin. They dropped their first nuke on the Bikini Atoll on June 30th, 1946. These were much bigger bombs than were dropped in Japan, and unlike the original tests, which were very secret, the US now wanted the world, or the Soviet Union, to know about it. It was like a giant PR campaign, the opposite of top secret, and it totally worked. Soon the whole world was like, what? The US is testing atomic bombs on a random atoll in the middle of the Pacific? A few days after this first test on Bikini, a French fashion designer released his new swimsuit. It was a two-piece women's swimsuit that, wait for it, revealed a woman's belly button. Highly scandalous. There was a ton of outcry. It was highly controversial, and when he announced it, he saw an opportunity to ride this publicity wave happening from the nuclear tests. So he named this swimsuit the Bikini. It was radical. It was scandalous. It was controversial, but it totally worked. He and his swimsuit got tons of attention, both good and bad. But the naming of the Bikini is just the beginning of how these nuclear bombs started shaping and influencing popular culture. Children's toys, comics, cartoons, superheroes, alcoholic drinks, beauty pageants, songs. The word atomic was everywhere. People started saying, "You're the bomb," as a compliment. People calling someone atomic now meant you're hot. And all the while, the tests on Bikini got bigger and more frequent, way bigger than anything that happened in Japan. Okay, but there's one more very important way that these nuclear tests on Bikini influenced our culture, and it's not swimsuits. And it's not even SpongeBob, who lives in Bikini Bottom and occasionally has a run-in with nukes. It's what happened in February 1954, when they tested this guy, a particularly huge bomb, 1,000 times larger than Hiroshima. When this bomb was detonated in Bikini, a Japanese tuna fishing boat named Lucky Dragon was nearby. It received a large dose of radiation, and the crew of 23 men returned to Japan, where they were hospitalized. It was reported that some of the tuna from their boat was sold and consumed by Japanese citizens. You have to understand, radiation is a freaky thing. It is this invisible force that destroys your cells without you ever seeing or feeling anything at first. This panic spread, and Japan's fishing economy took a giant hit. Japanese citizens were horrified. And when activists created a protest film which took place on an island that has a very similar resemblance to Bikini. And then near this island, a monster named Godzilla is born. He comes out of the ocean, quote, emitting high levels of H-bomb radiation. Are you getting where we're going here? The first thing that the monster does after emerging was destroying a tuna boat labeled Lucky Dragon. This film was a pointed protest at all of these tests and the effects that they were having on the local people, ecology, and economies. And it helped mobilize a fierce anti-nuclear movement in Japan that was already there because of what Japan had already experienced. Oh, and the film was actually pretty good, so the film actually came to the US too. It was dubbed over in English for US audiences, but it was renamed to Godzilla, and it was edited to remove all of the overt anti-nuclear symbols. The government's like, we can't have that happening. We're putting so much work into the PR of projecting how good nuclear weapons are. No way some protest film from Japan about a monster is going to derail this. So Godzilla lost its protest appeal and became just another monster movie. In the years following World War II, this is the total amount of explosive force detonated between the US and Soviet Union. But when broken down by location, you can see that 87% of this explosive force took place right here. So many bombs were dropped here, including one named Castle Bravo, which was literally 1,000 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. There's no way we can fathom this really, but we can sort of try to do a thought exercise to understand how powerful these bombs are. If you detonated this here in Washington, D.C., 90% of the population of D.C. and Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York would disappear in just 3 days. Okay, so unsurprisingly, back in Bikini, the locals never got to go back. That was never the intention. So, this story explains how we got the name for the swimsuit, the Bikini, why SpongeBob lives where he lives, and why we use the word bomb as a compliment. But it also teaches us a deeper lesson about what lengths we will go to retain power, or as some frame it, to maintain peace.